Welcome to Adult Forum. We are very pleased today to have with us Scott Washington. Like some of you, some of you were in the midst of. He obtained a degree from Duke Divinity School. He served churches in Massachusetts and North Carolina. And later, when he was in North Carolina, he had the opportunity to become the assistant director of the Orange County Historical Museum in Hillsborough. And from that, I guess I would gather it became an avocation as much as a job. Enamored with history. He'll be sharing some of his wealth of knowledge today, which is a nice mix of how religious people, faith beliefs help shape politics back in the origins of our country. And as I think he plans to mention, he's been doing a weekly radio segment on WCHL about history, which is now the longest running reminder of history in the country. So let's get historical. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at Duke Chapel. I just feel so comfortable. It's like my own home. I'm sure you all feel the same way. But really, and I had said this to Nelson earlier, how impressed I am, and everyone should be, for these unusual times we are in, that we have survived this long through the pandemic, and we may survive a little bit longer. But I think it's really a credit to so many good folks thinking creative ways out of the box. How do we get through the day, and more importantly, find things to be excited about? And we are doing it, and everyone should feel very good about all the steps you are taking to connect. And part of that connection involves our faith resources, and thank goodness we have things like Zoom. Thank goodness we have Duke Chapel that has continued to serve the public in such good ways when we need it, I think, as much as any time, as we've all re-examined what do we believe, what do we hold as important. So maybe we'll have another time where we do pandemic theology, because I think that's probably something we're all wrestling with and engaging with ourselves, is just exactly, where is God in the midst of this, and where is our faith and our convictions. Today is a good day, and of course it's a good day because Wednesday we did have this change in administration. And I don't know about you, but I breathed a sigh of relief. I felt like I have come back to the United States of America. Thank you very much. And it's been very interesting. Now, as a historian, and as Nelson alluded to, yes, my background, and I really credit Duke and the Divinity School for being rigorous about requiring primary sources and going back to those sources. And we read so many of them. And I found that I've really enjoyed looking through these documents and reading them in their originality, and then served churches here in North Carolina, in the North Carolina Conference. And then at one point, before I'll tell you about my Nantucket adventure, that's a little bit later up in Massachusetts, but I was raised as a Methodist and grew up in New England, born in the Midwest, but came down here and raised a family, and my kids, it's like herding cats, getting together with them, but thank goodness for Zoom. We all get together and have an opportunity to chat all the time, which is really fun. So I'll probably point them to this and say, hey, you want to see your dad in action? Turn on the YouTube and you can catch me there. But this particular area I got interested in because we had moved around a number of years, and I finally said, I think our kids need some stability. So I got hooked up with Eastman Kodak. Now, you think Eastman Kodak's Rochester, but they had a whole division down here in North Carolina. And so I really enjoyed learning about the history of George Eastman connected with North Carolina. And that kind of got me going with the history side, which had always been a passion throughout my life, but more so. And we said, gee, let's look at some other possibilities for serving in this area, and found this little museum over in Hillsborough, which I had visited even with my kids when they were little, and they were looking for an assistant director with my kind of skill set. So when I got there and really started understanding the history, I suddenly realized I was in the Disneyland of history right in Hillsborough. Now, let me see if a show of hands, anybody has been to Hillsborough and or ever gone there, or few people? Yes. Okay. Well, there. Oh, excellent. Well, you're all old timers. Well, I could just say, remember Churton Street. Well, the great thing about Hillsborough is we know that the historic section is laid out in the same way as a map of 1768 with the same street names today as that map. And they're in the same locations. I've even put a Google map over Hillsborough, and it turns out that everything is just about the same way. We've gone from horses to horsepower, but otherwise all these places are in the same location. It was always fun because Hillsborough not only has a mountain there that's a 500 million years old, the Occoneechee Mountain, and it's the tallest natural point between here and the coast. But also I would get some interesting calls. We think, well, you know, colonial history, and certainly anybody who is from other parts of the world, you will think, well, this is just like yesterday's history. But I was talking with Tim Duffy, who's the head of music makers in Hillsborough, who's a world-class musician who has done so much to carefully document the development of blues and jazz, and also to help rescue many of the musicians themselves and identify them and help get them paying gigs as musicians, even in their 70s or 80s. And he called me up one day and he said, and he has a house in Hillsborough, he said, I was digging around my backyard and found a strange arrowhead. Can you identify it? And I said, well, Tim, why don't you send me a picture? And I did. I was at the museum and my eyes widened. I called him back and I said, Tim, where is this? And he said, well, I've got it in my nightstand. I said, okay, you want to be a little more careful with that because that's what's called a Clovis spear point. It's from Native Americans who were here in the Americas 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. The proof that you found it in your backyard means that Hillsborough can lay claim, this little town, to having civilization there as far back as some of the ancient cities that we think of, Rome or London or other places. So, you know, I like to think that's a good thing about Hillsborough in terms of its history. But the colonial era history that I really became an expert at and just loved, just out of sheer curiosity, is what connected me with this greater, larger American story. It's kind of like a hologram of what's happening. So you saw my the words of my subject today: faith in colonial Carolina, courage, character, and conviction. And that really kind of sums up a little bit about what was happening. And I'm going to kind of give you some of the big picture scope of what was happening prior to this. And I think a big seminal date is about 1550. Now, there's nothing happening here in North Carolina, but that's when a fellow named Gutenberg invents a printing press. And this is an incredibly disruptive technology that will change not only the face of Europe and the world, but also will have impact coming into North Carolina. And of course, in 1555, he prints the Bible for the first time in German. And this is just, I cannot tell you what a game-changing moment this is in human history. It's not that it was necessarily fast, the printing process, but this movable type that could be set, and they could print this and then publish it, changed everything within the next 60 years. Martin Luther, of course, we think of him with the Reformation, 1517, but in part, Martin Luther is able to make his claim and not face death is because he can read the Bible, and he can also uh, go against the prevailing idea that when the Pope wanted to build, of course, we know the great cathedral there in Rome, but he sent emissaries out on a great fundraising trip. And some of them were maybe not, they didn't quite get the understanding of it. And they said, hey, we've got a great thing. If you make a donation, this is why Martin Luther got incensed about this idea of what he called indulgences. He said the fundraisers would say, if you make a donation, we can make sure that any of your relatives can get out of purgatory faster. And you can see this pay for play had some problems with it. And that was true when he rises up and Martin Luther says, here I stand, I can do no other. He's able to successfully resist Rome's heavy-handed ideas. Now, that I'm not saying the Pope was saying that it was strictly this, but some of the fundraisers were. And he said, no, we're saved by grace. It is not by the acts or how much money, it's by grace. This changes things. And that split will be reflected throughout Europe and really in world history in a huge way, because as the rise of nation states really develops, you see another change developing with people's identity and who they are. I don't know about you, has anybody taken any of these DNA tests or anything like that to see where they come from? You know, that my daughter finally, I told her stories about, oh, this relative, she she said, I want you to take a DNA test. And I said, well, what does that involve? She said, they'll send you a kit. I think it was 23andMe or something. This was several years ago. They probably got it much better. And you spit into a tube, you send this back. And I said, will I get my saliva back? No. They said, they'll keep that. But from there, they said they'll be able to sequence the DNA. Well, when I got it back, I started laughing. And my daughter said, well, okay, would you tell me where we're from? I said, oh, it's everywhere, just everywhere. And I was showing a map of Europe and part of Africa. I said, it's just incredible. Well, I was talking with another historian, a fellow from South Africa, who just loves really ancient history. And to him, it made total sense. He said, oh, yeah, there was no nation states back then. People moved around as there was other disruptions, whether it's droughts or famines or wars. And so there's a lot of movement throughout the entire world. If you were to look at the map at that time and speed it up, just like we do with, seeing plants go through slow motion, said you would see just a huge amount of movement. There wasn't the kind of nation state. There's a big melting pot. So it's very understandable why I would have a DNA scattered everywhere. It seems like I'm a world class traveler, very excited about that. And I mention all this because of what's developing between Martin Luther and, of course, the developments as we go forward into the 16th century, the 17th century. And I'm not going to bog down because I want to kind of speed up a little bit and say as we get into, of course, we know about Plymouth Rock. And this is a gigantic thing. When I grew up in Massachusetts, there was a little island known as, and today still known as, Cuttyhunk near Martha's Vineyard. And Cuttyhunk was a derivative of the Indian word Poo Cutahunkano. And I thought, wow, it meant Land's End. It was the farthest out of the Elizabethan chain. And in 1602, this intrepid explorer sails across from England, and he sails directly across the Atlantic. So he doesn't go up and around Newfoundland and then come down the East Coast. He sails across. His name is Bartholomew Gosnold. He actually is one of the people that goes with the Jamestown settlement. But in doing that, it changes everything about how we get to where we get to. Now, I think it was probably a trade secret of how he was able to establish being able to sail across, because the whole issue of longitude, in other words, where you are on the east and west lateral, is not really solved until the 18th century. But he figured a way to do this and charted his way by stars. But his little sloop, and he sails across, and he wants to establish the settlement. They're there about 6 months, and then his crew says, no, we're not going to stay here. This is too remote. It's fine as a summer place, but no. And so they sail back. And I always like to say that that particular voyage was successful because everybody lived. This was a major accomplishment. And not only that, but they bring back tales of this new land, and that fires the imagination. And in 1607, that's when this other expedition comes, and they don't go quite as high up on the East Coast as Massachusetts. They kind of come about midway, and we know them as the Jamestown development. Sadly, Bartholomew Gosnold dies because the first place they pick is swampy and it's not very good. Then they pick another place. But that's so important because it fires the imagination of people back in Europe, especially as trade begins to slowly develop and as more colonists come to this new world. Now, the whole East Coast was the equivalent of what we think of California. California is like the whole West Coast. Well, it would be like the East Coast of America at that time was like one giant state. And that's why when you come, Virginia could almost be extended all the way up to Massachusetts. It was like one giant thing. So when people said, well, where should we go? Well, let's go here where the climate might be a little bit better. And they aimed for Virginia. Wasn't a bad idea. This whole issue of America and what it is was fueled in a large part, here in North Carolina, one of the original 13 states, by a fellow named John Lawson. John Lawson did a wonderful trip, kind of coming inland, and then he wrote about it. And this is the book that he came up with that becomes A New Voyage to Carolina. And it's published in 1709. And this is an international hit. Now, it had always been on my to-do list to read this book and to say, well, why did this excite people's imagination? And so I had to wait till we had a really good hurricane and all the power went out. And so, reduced to candlelight, I said, it is the perfect time to replicate what the conditions must have been like for people reading this book by John Lawson. So I went ahead and I started reading by candlelight, and it was wonderful. Suddenly I understood, because it's not just this details and the way he writes it, but there are some racy passages where he's talking about the native Occaneechi tribe and all this kind of stuff. People in Europe are saying, that's where I want to go. Suddenly, North Carolina is a destination of choice. Now, to get to an idea of what the Americas begin to look like, it's a lot more like Europe than it is the America we know today. We have the Spanish, which have a settlement in Florida. We have the French, who are exploring the middle of the country. And then we have the English along the East Coast. They will come into friction, and but you'll also have people coming to this new America, and you've got to understand what this was like. It's the equivalent of Mars. When people talk about, we think of the globe today and we say, well, of course, people coming to one place. No, no, no. This trip, which finally the fastest kind of time you could sail on a boat was about 6 weeks one way to get to this country. Well, it is like going to another planet. It is a place where there are not the restrictions that you have in Europe, but instead you have a place where people can put their own ingenuity to work. And so North Carolina begins to grow in part because of John Lawson and his bestseller in Europe, which is talking about this great place where people could come. And then as people migrate here, they begin to write their relatives, and it starts going back to them about, oh yes, there's good places, plenty of land. And, you think of Europe and this time, that whole issue is pretty well locked up. You have people that own large swaths of land. You have the peasants, the people who are farming it. There's not a lot of ownership by individual people. There are big land holdings, especially in England. So this becomes an exciting idea, like, I want to go somewhere else. And as the rise of the printing press, which meant things like this book could be printed and distributed, that changes how people are having conversations about what they can do. So all of this is to say, now we're saying, well, how is this anything about faith in the Carolinas? Well, it's to give you the background of what was going on here, so that you have a little bit better idea of not only the disruptive technology, but more importantly, what happens as people come to this new colony. And England has its different ways of standardizing how things are. And if you ever come to the Orange County Historical Museum, you'll see a set of something called weights and measures. This was the way that civilization is advanced, not always through battles, but simply saying, is your pint the same as my pint? Is your gallon of measure the same as my gallon of measure? And until the early 70s in Hillsborough, they would actually have someone come out once a year dressed in colonial garb and with these weights and measures and declare that these were officially correct and they were to be trusted. And that became a major element for how civilization advanced. Well, another way that England decided to help establish civilization was through religion. And the Church of England was the church. And of course, as we know, the Pilgrims are coming from the Netherlands, and they're coming here because they can't practice their faith, again, because of the rise of the printing press. And the printing press means that people are beginning to read the Bible in their own language. And that means that people are interpreting what they're seeing. When I say their own language, it's of course a translation, but by being translated, it changes it. I mean, for centuries, you had the church and the Roman Catholic Church, it's in Latin. You had the priests conducting communion behind screens up at the front for the altar. No one would see that except the priests. The Reformation takes down those screens and begins to give people the opportunity to read and communicate in their own language. So we come into this part of the country, and you begin to have not only the migration of all these different people, but you have people like Presbyterians and Moravians and Methodists and Quakers and a few others, but they're all coming in. And one of the things that was fascinating as I've learned about it is that North Carolina had the largest amount of people migrating to this colony of any of the 13 during the 1760s. In fact, by the 1790 census, North Carolina is the third most populous state. It experiences tremendous growth. They go from, in the beginning of 1760, about 100,000. By 1770, it's almost 200,000. That's a huge amount of growth. And what's fueling it is all these people coming from different parts of Europe. They're speaking different languages. You're also getting people who are coming with their own set of beliefs that are not exactly the same as the Church of England. Nonetheless, the Church of England is a major influence. And so I'm kind of speeding things up, but kind of bringing you up to speed for, does this make any sense? Is everybody kind of following this? I know it's kind of fast and furious, but I'm trying to give you the overall picture of disruptive technology, printing press, and also the rise of religious expression and the desire to understand and claim a faith that's more in tune with one's own convictions. much like Duke Chapel is ecumenical, here is North Carolina, and this is an ecumenical place in a real way. And we have Baptists here as well. And this means that you have some very interesting dialogues and people of great conviction. And in the around 1754 to around 1765, there is a fellow named Arthur Dobbs. He becomes the colonial governor of North Carolina. He is born in Scotland, but he is raised in Ireland. And he becomes this governor for a long period of time. And to get you an idea of what it's like, and he also thought, let's bring the Church of England here as well. So he's helping to build churches. But when he's here, you see a huge influx of people from Scotland. Now, are any of you familiar with the Diana Gabaldon series, the Outlander series? Have you ever heard of that one? Or it's one where it was hard for me to even find it in bookstores. She was in high tech, and then about 20 years ago, she decided, I think I'm just going to write a historical thriller. And so she began to write these giant tomes that are about 1,200 pages each, which is why I never found them in bookstores. All about, and it's a kind of a blend of science fiction and history and romance and all this. But they're wonderful books because she does do a lot. I call her the Charles Dickens of these kind of books because she is so evocative and so sensory in details. Well, she sets her story is some people are in Scotland. They go into one of these kind of like Stonehenge circles and then get transported back in time, yes, to 18th century colonial America, specifically here in the Carolinas. And that's why there's a show called the Outlander series, which talks about that. And part of that setting is here during these tumultuous years of the 1760s. Around 1764, this another person comes over to North Carolina named William Tryon. William Tryon is an English officer who had fought with the British against the French. He had been wounded. He came back, but fairly ambitious, fairly ruthless, and he was someone who knew about military conduct. And he comes into the Carolinas in 1764 as lieutenant governor. He's expecting to take over from Governor Dobbs, who suddenly who had said, it's time for me to, I think I'd like to go back. And I don't know why he said it, because as soon as Lieutenant Governor Tryon arrives, suddenly Governor Dobbs has a renewed sense of energy and says, you know what, I'm not going to go anywhere. I think I'm going to stay governor here for a while, leaving Mr. Tryon kind of high and dry, going, wait a minute, this was not the deal. It takes until March, and then conveniently, when Governor Tryon is up in Virginia, that Governor Dobbs dies. And how convenient now, Tryon can move into being the governor. And so from 1765 to 1771, he's the governor. But there is going to be friction here. And that friction says so much about what America becomes. And that's why I'm kind of leading to this kind of a point, because it's important to understand what occurs in North Carolina during these years. There is a peaceful protest movement that develops in North Carolina. And it develops by people of faith and conviction who are faced with enormous fees. And Governor Tryon wanted to consolidate the government so that it's in one place. And he had looked at different places. Wilmington was long established, but those people could get a little rowdy. So he decides New Bern is the right place to not only have the governor's palace, but also to have a place for the legislature to meet. And he's expecting to stay here a long time. So he persuades the legislature, we need £5,000 to build this this place where everyone can meet. Well, it will mushroom to be 3 times that amount. And they turn to the people of the state to help pay for it. There had been during the 1760s some financial issues related to money. And even I've read the letters where Governor Tryon himself is appealing to London, please, we need to get credit established so that we can get more money out to people. And London says, no, they've got traders who are trading back and forth, and we don't want lines of credit. We don't want pieces of paper from North Carolina saying we will pay you. That doesn't. We want hard currency. Well, hard currency is hard to come by, and it's left up to the local officials in these counties to actually collect the taxes. And there's a kind of an incentive. And to give you an idea of what this was like back in the time, the whole eastern seaboard, the whole 13 states are kind of managed like an entrepreneurial endeavor. And that is to say that a lot of leeway is granted governors. And of course, they are corresponding with London and sending information. It's going back and forth, but it's taking 6 weeks to go one way. There's whatever kind of discussion and then another 6 weeks. So there's quite a long lag period between what's going on here in the colonies and what's occurring in London. And so therefore, the governors here have a lot more leeway, or they take it in terms of making sure to get things done that need to be done. Otherwise, everyone would not be doing anything. And that leads to excesses as well. The certain officials were granted salaries, but a lot of local officials were given appointments to positions, but they were not given a salary. Instead, it was assumed that in their duties of collecting taxes, and they would say, yes, I'll do this, that they would take a portion of those taxes. Well, you can see how this might pose some conflicts for people. If you're collecting taxes and your livelihood depends on that, then there's a huge incentive to make sure that you collect as much as possible so that you can pocket as much as possible. And the registry for fees was so ambiguous at points that it led to lots of creative interpretations. And we might call it just outright favoritism by today's standards. And that meant that people began to protest that. And they also didn't have the money. And one other problem is people would say, you know, here I have a thriving farm. We don't have money. And they would come in to pay their taxes and say, I don't have it, but I can provide 30 bushels of wheat to pay the taxes. And the response they would get out in this part of the state would be, no, we don't want your wheat. We want your money. And if you can't have it, we're going to seize your farm and we will sell it at auction. And of course, the only people who could afford to buy it at auction turned out to be the very officials who were refusing the produce. And so they would pick up valuable farms. This did not endear them to the people who were actually making this state. And that led to all kinds of issues. And have you heard of the term regulators? Has anybody heard of that before? In Durham, there's a regulator bookstore. It's not exactly the same, but they get their name from the people who were out in this part of the state. In 1752, because of the sheer growth of immigration from other places, not only in the colonies as well as abroad, they have to make another county. It's called Orange County. Orange County today consists of Chapel Hill and Carrboro and Cedar Lake and Hillsborough. But back then, the original Orange County in 1752 was a large swath of land, encompasses approximately what are about 10 different counties today. And the county seat is out near Haw River. I don't know if any of you have been out there, but it's a little further out. And after 2 years of that, people say, this is a little too far to the west. And they make this planned county seat of Hillsborough. And it's laid out like a real English town. And that's why we have a map of 1768. Streets are in the same name, same street names. And in fact, I could direct people from that map when they say, is there a good place to eat? And I would point and say, yes, you they said, you're looking at a 1768 map. I said, it's still accurate, which is kind of remarkable. But here is this county seat that becomes a place where people have to come into. I like to refer to it as the Las Vegas of North Carolina. They even had a racing track, they had taverns. This is the place you would come, and if you had a long journey, you would pay your taxes. Well, that becomes problematical. When Tryon comes here, he is coming from a military background, and everything is kind of by the books. Of course, he's getting a cut of all this. If you're giving commissions and appointing people, well, it would be normal to reward and to express your gratitude to the governor for giving you this appointment by making a donation. And that's exactly what happens. So there's a kind of some backhanded issues going, but more than that, people are really raising questions about how fees and taxes are being determined. And in Orange County, in Little Hillsborough, there's one young fella who happens to get along with Governor Tryon just swimmingly. His name is Edmund Fanning. He's a Yale-trained lawyer who had come down here to seek his fortunes. And Hillsborough goes through several different name changes. Corbinton, Childsburg. I thought if it had been Childsburg, they could have done a lot with, attracting kids here. No, it's for some other reason. Eventually it becomes Hillsborough. And Edmund Fanning is one of those kind of people who's very loyal to his friends. He loves England. He loves the English colonial way, and he gets along with Governor Tryon like a foot and a sock. They are just two of the same type. And he's rather ruthless in enforcing these regulations. And that means that a lot of people are losing farms and lands, and people begin to write letters of protest. Now, as I say, what we're seeing here in North Carolina, this is why I get excited about this history. So let's see, it is now almost 10:23. That means we're getting to the point where I'm really excited about this history. Has he not been excited about everything before? Yes, I have. But why I'm excited about this history here is because here in North Carolina becomes a microcosm of the larger American story. Now we think, and I was born in the Midwest, grew up in New England, and went to the Old North Church and walked around Boston. I knew all of that, but until I got down here to North Carolina, did I really realize the significance of what was happening here. So you get this influx of all these people who are reading the Bible for the first time, and these Bibles were really large. This is like a pew Bible that a pulpit Bible, but this was the thing that people were reading from because the printing presses were big. They weren't making small ones, they were making this, and this would be the one that something like this size that people would turn to. And they're interpreting the Bible in new ways. They are people of strong convictions, and they are bringing those convictions, those matters of faith, to bear witness to what they're seeing, because it's about truth. And they're seeing some things that don't seem to be right. So a peaceful protest movement, and you think of all America is as much defined by that freedom of speech that we have, the willingness of people just to walk and say, I'm protesting for this, against this. I never worry too much about the state of America. I said, in the nation of 331 million people, the aberrations get more of the attention, but the reality is there's a lot of people doing good all the times, and we will argue just for the sake of arguing here in the United States. And if you say you can't argue, I'll say, well, fine, but somebody's going to say, I'm going to argue about I can't argue, because we like to do that. So we're very rambunctious, and the rest of the world looks at us and say, what is going on here? But in North Carolina in the 1760s, this is a big issue. People are really raising thoughtful questions about the propriety of how things work. and why is it occurring the way it is? And it seems unfair. And we know from our faith resources and background that, of course, issues of fairness and justice are very much connected with love and worship and prayer and all the other parts of what we associate with our church-going experience. And it's reflected in our hymns, it's reflected in our services. But it's also this long legacy of people standing up and saying, it's not right, and God told me so. And that's certainly what the prophets do. Well, that's happening in North Carolina. They're raising this, and they raise them in a number of ways, including just basically these petitions to the governor. And the reason these people are called the regulators is because, believe it or not, they're actually for regulation. They want things to be standardized. And the other reason is the people who are clearing the roads, who are patrolling them, since there is no standing army, there's militias, and the police, well, not really much of a police. There is a sheriff, usually for a county, but the sheriffs also are the ones who are collecting taxes. So you can see how this creates some friction. And for people coming from Europe, where they were locked into certain kind of set rules or roles, and more than that, where you had religion that said it's only one way or the highway, they said, well, fine, we're going to take the highway over to Mars, which is this new world, because we want to be able to practice our faith and to raise our family with the values that we hold to be important. So they start to raise these questions, and it's coming really out of their faith convictions. All these different people that are bringing their avenues of faith, their understanding, especially these Congregationalist movements, the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Moravians and the Quakers, that still small voice. These people of conscience are not hierarchical from the top down. They're coming together and forming associations of like-minded people. De Tocqueville in the early 19th century would talk about this as being a defining characteristic of Americans is we tend to join things. If you're here today, it's because you said, well, I want to be here. Well, we have a tremendous amount of choice to join different groups and different affiliations. And I think that's another hallmark of what America is and why it's an exciting place, is because not only do we have that freedom to do it, but these other essential freedoms. The original people here in the colonies, when they said they were for regulation, they were not in the sense of, they wanted structure. And one of the things when they talked about freedom, it wasn't so much freedom as protected civil liberties. This is an essential difference. The freedom to just do as we like, whenever we like, well, there may have been some like that, but most people wanted to say, I want to have protected civil liberties. This becomes a major element here in North Carolina. Freedom of speech is tied to freedom of religion, the ability to petition the government for a redress of your grievances was coming out of these people of faith here in the Carolinas who are bringing their faith convictions where they had been persecuted in Europe, and they're coming here, and they're bringing their own interpretations of what that means. But it's very central. And the other, as I talked about, this disruptive technology that leads to the printing of books, it leads to also the rise of printing presses and the newspapers here in America. And this is another disruptive change that changes how things are going to be communicated. Because for the first time, people can print up newspapers, and it takes about 3 weeks from news here in the North Carolina to get up to Massachusetts. But there's a steady stream of news going on. Colonial Williamsburg, anybody been there or heard about it or anything? Yes. Well, it's wonderful. And another thing that, in addition to saving this history that Colonial Williamsburg is so good about, kind of off the map, is they also have done tremendous amounts of very thoughtful research and saving that the archiving of materials, including the newspapers from that era that were being printed there. And it's just a gold mine. I love reading them. Now, I get excited about the stuff that's 250 years old, and I'll call my kids and say, "Oh, this happened." They said, "Yeah, Dad, you're talking about that happened like yesterday." And I said, "Well, yes, this is so." And they said, "Yeah, can you tell us what actually happened yesterday?" As opposed to what happened 200 years. I said, "Well, you don't understand." He said, "Yes, Dad, we do understand." And it's because it's full of the kind of stuff that's gossipy. We've heard that Mrs. L has received news from her nephew in Glasgow that this is happening, and so we're just reporting that. Another person saying, "If you have any debts, contact me because I'm going to be leaving, going back to England." And other times it's about the emerging news that keeps developing. Here in North Carolina, you also have some newspapers that are developing, and this is going to make just a big difference in communication. It's like the internet of the 18th century. And now, when we think of music, there's Handel and Haydn, and Bach is still being heard, but music is also another part of all this. And I just want to kind of give you a flavor of all this so that you have a better sense of what's happening here in this part of the country, because here in North Carolina is where people begin to act out what we think of as the American spirit. It's in our DNA. There's freedom of speech, freedom of religion. People are not just saying, "Oh, I'm going to wait for these rights." They're actually practicing them. And up against the friction of this is Governor Tryon trying to establish the Anglican Church, which was also the only place that you could get technically married and have that marriage recorded. It didn't stop people from connecting and marrying, and sometimes more than once, we've found in some places, but they would, you had to go through the Church of England, and you had to pay a tax anyways to support this, which also grew resentment. One of the churches that grows up here in the Carolinas is in Hillsborough. It is no longer there, but it was one of the larger churches. And this larger church was right on the corner of what we now know as Tryon and Churton Street in downtown Hillsborough. It's where the Orange County Historical Museum building is located, and it's right on that same corner lot where the Hillsborough Presbyterian Church is. This church is there, and it's one of the larger buildings in the entire North Carolina colony. And so therefore, during the Revolutionary War, when there is an actual pitched battle in the streets of Hillsborough at one point, the church is a place where people take refuge. And after the war, this big, gigantic building is about the only place large enough to actually hold a meeting. So I'm going to tell you I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but what happens to kind of bring you up to speed if you don't know about this, and this is why I get excited about this history, is by 1771, by 1770, things have come to a head. All the attempts to persuade Governor Tryon to change things, to intercede, have fallen on truly deaf ears, even despite these peaceful protests that literally over years, I really can only believe that the reason it stayed peaceful is because there were people of conscience and conviction who really did believe that things would come to the right end of things. And sometimes when we look back at the Bible and we're going through texts and we're trying to understand the sequences and times and places where there were no rights, you still found people with voices of conscience speaking up. And here in North Carolina is where this all is kind of consolidated. And when Governor Tryon is starting to look towards going back to England, and he's thinking about it, but then things change and kind of speeds up that timetable. Some people get impatient finally after many years, and they come into Hillsborough, and this is a rough and rowdy bunch. and they beat up a couple of people with the courts. They have had it, the last straw, because some of these people called regulators are now facing court costs and fines. And so they don't want that. They go to this fellow Edmund Fanning, who's become very prosperous under Governor Tryon and certainly seizing lands. And it's on King Street. So if you're ever in Hillsborough, right across from the Colonial Inn, there's a Masonic Lodge. And this is where Edmund Fanning's house was. But these guys are rough and rowdy. And at the end of September of 1770, they know what to do in terms of building houses and also taking them apart. In the 18th century, to build a house, you would chop down your lumber, you would shape it into kind of basically what you want to do, and then you'd let it air dry for 6 months to a year, and then you'd put it together. So they knew how to put together houses and how to take them apart. So here they are at Edmund Fanning's house, the end of September, and they break in and they see all the finery. Edmund Fanning is not there at that moment, and that's the last straw. So they could have torched the house, but that would have endangered other buildings. So they say, no, wouldn't have been, I'm sure some of them, we don't have this account, but I'm sure someone said, wouldn't it be great if like a comet came and just leveled the place, like the hand of God? And they said, that's not a bad idea. And so they literally tear down his house by hand until it's just rubble. So Edmund Fanning finally comes back into town after several days, and they're just imagining the look on his face when they see house, rubble, house. And he doesn't think it's so funny. When Governor Tryon gets wind of it, he does not think it's so funny. And so Governor Tryon believes he'll have his revenge, and he begins to plot a true revenge. He gets the legislature to pass laws giving him emergency powers. And he thinks this gives him carte blanche to do as he pleases. He raises a mercenary army, and he gets wind of a tax refund that had been promised by a local official. And when regulators had met with them, and they said, you're right, let's set a date. We'll set a date for May, and we'll come together, and then we'll make sure that you can get some of your money back. They think this is a great idea. Well, Governor Tryon gets wind of this, and he marches out. And he had asked for and gotten cannon sent to him. And this is a former military man. He is no longer negotiating. This is now going to be as much of revenge, because he's also learned that he's going to become governor of New York. So even before he leaves New Bern, he already knows that he's been appointed governor of New York. There's no really reason for him to go out. He could just have gotten on the boat and said, I'm leaving now. See you all. Take care. He doesn't do that. And this is the history that you are not going to find necessarily in the books, because it's what I started finding and said, this is what happened here in North Carolina in 1771 that changes everything. And this is what occurs. So he goes out to Alamance County, where these peaceful protesters are waiting to gather, and they're saying, let's just make sure we'll be here. We're going to go in, and they're camping out basically, and then we'll be first in line to get our tax refund. But instead, Governor Tryon shows up, and he has cannons and I call it the mercenary army. There's militia, but they're all paid to be there. And it looks very impressive. Well, they think he's out there to negotiate with them. They don't really want to hear anything. But Governor Tryon is there for a different reason. He's going to teach them a lesson. And so he gives them an hour, tells them, pay your taxes, lay down your arms, swear allegiance, or else. And I think he's bluffing. And they're hurtling back and forth insults and so on. The governor is not bluffing. And so one of the people who were negotiating for this large group of people, upwards of, in some accounts, 1,500 to 2,000 people, 1,800 folks. Governor Tryon has about 1,100 people, but they're armed. They have cannon. They have state-of-the-art muskets that you can reload 2 to 3 times a minute, as opposed to the standard musket, which would take about 45 seconds to get a shot off. You had people who got very good at shooting, but still these rifles are not terribly accurate. And so some people are armed, but a lot of people would come because they're just there because it's the right place to be, expecting this tax refund that's supposed to happen in the next week. Governor Tryon has different plans. So of the negotiators, he takes both of them prisoner. And one fellow, Robert Thompson, said, well, that's nuts. I didn't sign up for this. You can't hold me. And he walks back. And the accounts are whether it's Governor Tryon who shoots him or he orders someone to shoot him. But I'm guessing it's probably Governor Tryon. Shoots him, kills him. This gunshot rings out. Other people who are, on the other side, and, they're just saying, this is a great day and we can't wait. And finally we'll have some justice. They snap their heads around. And Governor and a few people kind of belatedly try to fire shots to alert everyone. And people look up. And at that point, Governor Tryon says fire, and his militia with him, his mercenary army, they kind of hesitate, and he basically repeats it: fire on them or me, fire. And so they do, and they open up with cannon, and it's a terrible toll, and it's this battle that goes on that runs about 2.5 hours. It's actually turns out to be one of the longer battles that you would even find in the Revolutionary War. I call it one of the great defensive battles that occurs, because these people who had peacefully gathered, and some had brought rifles just because, well, that's what you do. I mean, you had your own kind of personal protective gear, and suddenly they're being attacked by Governor Tryon. And they begin one of the great defensive battles in American history against enormous odds by military power. And they begin to fight back, and it allows the majority of people to leave. 1,500 people are able to escape. The people who stay are the hardcore, and they are now, it's 1,100 with cannon and men versus a small group of almost 300 or so. I'm a little over 300. So if you've heard about the Greeks and the 300, battling, well, this is something similar. And they fight a terrific battle. And finally, they just fight till they run out of ammunition. There are so few people left alive that they only can get 15 prisoners. Governor Tryon's secretary is exuberant, and so he writes to Governor Waddell, who didn't show up, who was of the Colonial militia that was supposed to show up, but was confronted by regulators, and he decides, no, I don't think I'm going to go anywhere given this angry group of people that don't want me to be there. But Governor Tryon writes to Governor Waddell and expresses the fact that about 300 of the regulators were killed. Now, this is not something that is commonly known. I remember 25 years ago going out to Alamance County, and at that point, and still is, I think there's been some shift, but it was about 9 dead on the governor's side and 61 wounded. That stays stable. But the other side, it's only after the Revolutionary War when they're interviewing some of the old timers from the regulator side, and they're not even sure many people had fled, those who had lived. And they're saying, when they said, well, the governor said it's 9 and 60. Oh, yeah, that sounds about right. So when I was out there and I thought, well, now how do you stop this big protest movement that's talking about freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom to gather and petition? And I said, how do you stop that with equal numbers? They seem fairly low, but this is lopsided. We also know that this account is actually published in the papers in London, the equivalent of the Reader's Digest, the Gentleman's Quarterly, and 300, that is the number that's printed, and it's just shocking. It's absolutely shocking. What happens here in North Carolina sends ripple waves throughout the entire eastern seaboard. And suddenly, people realize as the word gets out about what happens here, and there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation and intentional misdirection, that people are saying, good heavens, what happened down there? And it will reflect how changes occur going forward. Now, I know we're right at the end. But to speed up things, it's why North Carolina becomes a leader in looking at these issues. 1788, there's a constitutional convention. It's held in Hillsborough. It's to talk about ratifying the new U.S. Constitution. It had to go out to the 13 states. North Carolina is the only one of the 13 that actually voted to postpone ratifying the Constitution until provisions are made for introducing a Bill of Rights to Congress and the ratifying states. They meet in Hillsborough, where 6 men are hanged in June of 1771 by Governor Tryon for participating in this insurrection, when it wasn't that at all. It was an attack on these, now we would call them Americans. There was no Bill of Rights to protect them then, and that's why this becomes a major issue for North Carolina. And why the new U.S. Congress takes it up as one of their first issues, and 12 amendments are sent out to the states. Its concern satisfied, North Carolina becomes the only state to meet for a second time in Fayetteville in November of 1789. They ratify the Constitution, and within the month they ratify the amendments. Third state to do that. 2 years later, when Virginia ratifies the amendments, 10 of 12, which get enough votes, become the ones we call the Bill of Rights. They become the part of the Constitution. And thank goodness there's a fellow from Connecticut, William Sherman, who had been with the whole country right from the beginning and been a part of all the different Congresses. And when the issue came about amending the Constitution, he said, no. It was hard enough getting the original document. If we're going to amend it, those amendments are going to come on afterwards, which is why if you ever read the Constitution, which is printed in plain English, anyone can read it, the amendments are printed on afterwards. And when you read those amendments, like I do, especially those first 10, they really speak to what North Carolina was starting to envision as this is what America is all about. Other countries all around the world have constitutions. Even the nation states that we might feel uncomfortable being a part of, but they don't have some of these protections that are part of the Constitution that protect all of us, including this right to worship, this right to gather, this right to talk about things however we want, to interpret history, to interpret scripture the way that makes sense. And that still small voice of conscience, that candlelight, burns as brightly today as it did when people came to this part of the country seeking freedom, but more important, protected civil liberties that are essential to who we are as people of faith, and that have lasted us like a burning candle over the last 4 years. I think the lights are a lot brighter today, and I think that's a good thing. Now that I've been talking on and on, you can see I get excited. I know we're getting close to the time. Do you have any questions? Or if you have, you should just say, wait, what is this? But I'm open to any of them, and certainly I am not shy about talking about this great history, disruptive technology, printing, the influx of migrants, and all of you have come from somewhere else. And it's like, thank you very much. This is the American story. We're going to have the Statue of Liberty here on our Zoom cam. And I think that would be as fitting a symbol for what North Carolina is about, and certainly what Duke Chapel represents, which is an open hand of hospitality to people of all faith traditions that come together and we find common ground. But I hope that helps a little bit. Is there anything that you all have questions about or answers to? I'm always glad when people say, oh no, you're totally wrong. I say, wonderful. I'm so eager to learn. I will come up with a question to meet your answer. But any ideas or anything else I should know about? You say, if Nelson says at this point, well, this is normally when we have where you recite something by heart. We're waiting for that part, but no, or the competitive dance-off. That would be another thing. I'm glad to try if that's the case. But
this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. I am an immigrant to North Carolina, if you will.
Wonderful.
And so I don't know all of this history. And I'm just wondering, have you written this down somewhere, or is there something, some references you could suggest to follow up on it?
Yeah. Well, there are some really good sources. We have a lot of history, thank goodness. The University of North Carolina saved a lot of the colonial era documents, numbering in the thousands. They were going to be thrown in the trash or burned, but luckily the Secretary of State went, wait a minute, let me check this out. And he said, no, no. And he was a great proponent. This is around 1880, and he saved all this. And so we have this wonderful cache of documents that have now been digitized that you can read yourself. And it's just eye-opening to see what people were, the kind of correspondence that was going on in the state as North Carolina begins to develop into a very robust state. As far as writing it down, a lot of it's from doing tours of the Orange County Historical Museum for thousands of folks from around the state, around the country, and around the globe. And of course, people who come from different parts of the United States, or really rather other parts of the world, who have ancient cultures like Korea, 5,000 years, or China, they would would nod indulgently, like I was excited about 300 years. Like, yes, okay, well, good. Well, we'll give it a few more 1,000 years, and maybe you'll see where folks are. It's in different places, and certainly there are different sources you can look up, and some of this is online. People have been finding the information. I get excited because of being at the divinity school, and we're dealing with primary sources, and the professors who would say, you must read this 15th century text. And I'm like, oh no. But in diving through that, I found how much I enjoyed it. And in the 18th century, some of that is just long run-on sentences. And people are talking extemporaneously, a little bit like I'm doing today, and they just go on and on and on. And there's you're reading this, you're going, I'm getting tired. So there are some good sources that, for instance, the North Carolina Museum of History, if you all haven't, if you have a chance to get there, even I think in these COVID days, they've had it open, but they have a wonderful exhibit about North Carolina history. You can walk through it, and it is just tremendous. It's a permanent exhibit. So it really will give you kind of an idea of like what was happening in this part of the country, and how it grows. Between Native Americans, we have, of course, slavery is part of this state, but not entirely all of it. A lot of the farming area in the eastern part of the state requires that kind of labor-intensive capital, and that's where you find a lot of slavery occurring. But North Carolina becomes mixed. By the time of the Civil War, actually, North Carolina is one of the last states because there are so many people who are pro-union here. And that's a whole nother topic. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. But of course, that's not controversial at all, is it? No, but in some ways, it's really important history to talk about, and how people were persuaded to join the wrong side of history, and what happened with that. So, but in terms of writing it down there, I mean, I would say that John Lawson's book, A New Voyage to the Carolina, published 1709, is still pretty interesting reading. You can get it, especially by candlelight, especially if there's a storm. You go, oh man, this looks like a cool country. But that's good. And then there are some general histories about North Carolina that are exciting. But North Carolina is a pretty dynamic place that really has been in the leadership of so much. If you look at some of the 18th century maps of North Carolina, it's very detailed, lots of rivers. And the rivers are the super highways of North Carolina. In fact, here is Hillsborough is 180 miles inland, but just 12 miles away, the Haw River was a tributary of Cape Fear. And before there's man-made lakes that develop, when the waters would get high from rains or flood, they could literally float things all the way down from here all the way to the coast. textiles and lumber. That's just a kind of an amazing thing to think about. And the whole issue of how I got to Nantucket has a Hillsborough connection. Where did that church go? Well, there's some possibility, some interesting dotted lines that it might have ended up in Nantucket. That's a whole nother story. So maybe you'll invite me back and tell, how did you get to Nantucket? We don't want to hear a limerick, but maybe you can tell about how and that was supposed to be like Gilligan's Island for 3 weeks. Can you come up and help save our church? They said, well, I don't know about that. That's more God's business, but I'll be glad to come up there. And ended up being there 6 months, and the church is still going strong. But when they looked at this Methodist church in the 1780s and had an architect from Colonial Williamsburg looked at it and said, well, the outward part of this church, 1823, but the superstructure of this church is an 18th century building of unknown origin that is not accounted for on Nantucket. Down here, I was missing a church. At the end of the 1790s, it gets sold and disappears into the mists of history. I had some family friends who were visiting, and we were talking about this, and I said, I laughed. I said, isn't it funny? You have a church, you don't know where it comes from. I have a church that it disappears, and I don't know where it went. And we thought, well, that's just kind of ha-ha, until they mentioned a name, and I did this double take, and I said, Fanning. I said, we have an Edmund Fanning. I said, let me check. And I immediately got online, looked up something, and my eyes went large and went, this Edmund Fanning is the uncle of the people on Nantucket. I said, oh. So then about a year later, they said, can you come help save our church? I said, well, I've got to come up to Nantucket to see what that's all about. There's some interesting dotted lines. Maybe it's the same building, don't know, but it's kind of fun. But any other questions or comments or concerns? I get excited about this history because it's American history, and this week is when American history was made, when we had a change of administration, and I think we're all still celebrating. I know I am. I felt like I'm finally coming back to my own country again, and that's a good feeling as we all get to really savor these important moments. But I know we're right here at the moment when Duke Chapel is going to be starting its worship, and we want to be a part of that. Nelson, any final words that you need for us, or Michael too, either one?
Before more people drift away, it's time for everybody to unmute and see who's applauding the loudest.
Well, I would applaud all of you for being here. And thank you for inviting me.
This was very interesting. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Wonderful.
Next week, we will hear again from Jillian Marcantonio, a div school student. She will be talking with us about climbing the mountain with Moses, an introduction to apophatic theology, which I think sort of is again the line between religious belief and direction and governing the people. So some common themes with today.
Excellent.
We also had a suggestion that while some of you come to class early and socialize a little bit, we will start a tradition of lingering after class. So while the recording will stop, anybody who wants to hang around and ask more questions or talk about the weather or whatever, feel free to do that. Thank you.